Okay, we are going to be in Ezra tonight, as the people have demanded. It's funny, my brother, who is a youth pastor um, in a local church, is preaching a sermon series for people going back to church from Ezra on returning, which I thought was kind of interesting. He shot me his notes this week um, to kind of look at. So kind of cool. So it's kind of cool that we're in this book without even really planning that, but there's definitely some parallels I think we can apply. Anyway, what happened last week in Ezra?
You mean apart from trying to having enough timelines convoluted that it could have been an episode of Doctor Who?
Apart from that, yes.
If I recall, and I'm not mixing up my weeks, the people around them, the Samaritans and the Ammonites and a couple others, went and tattled on them and got executive orders for them to cease and desist on building the temple.
Yeah. Yep. The people around them kind of pressured them into stopping them. And then we got into this discussion about uh, the timeline. What was the problem with the timeline? Problem was it doesn't line up. We kind of forward travel in chapter 4, and then we backwards travel in time for chapter 5. They're doing that to make the author's doing that to make a theological point about the continual opposition to rebuilding Jerusalem. Um, like Wingen said, it's really not worth getting that hung up on. That we move forward in time and then backwards in time. It's not the first time this has happened. I mean, we did it in Judges several times as well. So it's definitely something that's acceptable in the literature of the time, um, and even today for plot devices and whatnot. The important thing is that there's definitely um, resistance to the rebuilding of the temple. So last week, the temple building stopped, and what was the Persian king's name when it stopped? And it said it stopped until somebody else. So from whom to whom did it stop?
Was it Xerxes to Darius?
Yep. Cyrus to Darius. Xerxes comes after Darius, so it was from Cyrus until Darius. Yep. Cyrus is the guy who gives the initial order to go back to Jerusalem. Cyrus is the one who kind of is the great king of Persia. He is the one who takes over Babylon, inherits the Babylonian kingdom, and then and that kind of establishes Persian dominance over the ancient Near East. So from Cyrus to Darius. Okay, so we're going to be picking the story up during Darius's his reign this week. Um, yeah, and we'll go from there. So, can I have a volunteer to read verses 1 through 5 of chapter 5? By the way, we're going to sneak into chapter 6 this week. Don't tell Winged. But it just flows better from a narrative perspective.
Don't tell Winged, he says.
He'll never see it through the dishes. Okay. All right. Can I have a volunteer to read verses 1 through 5 of chapter 5? Go for it, Cass.
Prophets Haggai and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak arose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. At the same time, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar-bozenai and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus: Who gave you decree to build this house and to finish this structure? They also asked them this: What are the names of the men who are building this building? But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until the report should reach Darius, and then an answer be returned by a letter concerning it.
Thank you. Okay. So we're introduced to two prophets at the beginning of this, Haggai and Zechariah. Those names seem kind of familiar. Where have we heard those names before? Yeah, they're books of the Bible. So you can actually read their remarks in their own respective books. But basically, they tell the people of Israel to stop being fearful and to rebuild the temple and Jerusalem. So, what happens? Well, how do the people of Israel respond to these words from the prophets? Yeah. They go do it. Okay. All right. So they get started, and this is most likely in the third year of Darius's reign. Just for some context there. So if we look back up, that puts us at about 519 BC. So the people start rebuilding the temple. Okay. Then we get these other guys entering the story. Good question, Kess. So we figure that they restarted the first building project some number of years after Cyrus takes over, right? Because Cyrus is the one who decrees that they rebuild the temple. I don't know the exact year. I think there's some debate about it, but probably around 545 ish to 519. So we're looking at 25-ish years, 20 years. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And the sources are going to disagree a bit, but yeah, that's about what we're looking at here for a gap. Okay. So same people around them still. We get these names, Zerubbabel and Yeshua, um, who are leaders of Israel. I don't want to say they're not important, but people make a big deal about who these guys are, and it's honestly not that important to the narrative. So we're gonna move on to they're just leaders who are helping facilitate the rebuilding of the temple. I don't get too hung up on it. Next, we have the guys from Persia. So Titania, the governor of the province beyond the river. What's the province beyond the river again? We talked about this last week.
That depends on who you ask.
It does depend upon who you ask. So what's the river?
That depends on who you ask.
It's not the Minnesota River.
I'd say it's not the New River, even though I use that as an example.
The Mississippi River was the example that we used. Yep. Yes, the Euphrates. So the province beyond the river is most likely. So there's a little bit of debate about this, but it's either Babylon, so Babylonian territories, or Western Babylon. So there's some people who think that they kind of divided the province into two provinces. Okay, so we talked about at the first study, if you remember all the way back when we were setting the context. Remember how the Persian Empire is divided into what we would call governors, what they called suzeraintes, right? These guys who are kind of report to the king. and make sure that uh, their particular province is doing well. They have the power to tax, raise armies, defend that area, kind of govern as a sub king under the main king, right? So, um, the Babylonian province is an incredibly important province because it contains Babylon, which is a rich city, and it contains Judea. Judea is important because it links several key parts of the Babylon Empire. Okay, it links Egypt, which is under Babylon. I'm sorry, Persian Empire. It links Egypt to the rest of the empire, and Egypt is a very advanced society that is under Persian control. It also is how you would get from Egypt up to Asia Minor, or Asia as they'd call it back then, and then from there into Babylon proper. So it's kind of a crossroads, a very important trade network, strategic area that it contains with this. So yeah, so these guys are important guys in the Persian Empire. So how do they respond to the building of the temple? Yeah, yeah, they get uncomfortable by this. Okay, why are they potentially uncomfortable?
If this ends up causing any political trouble, their heads will roll.
Yeah, yep, yeah. Um, their heads will roll or they'll be impaled. There's lots of creative ways that the Persians would kill you. The Persians really inherited a nice book of execution from the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And even though they are much more willing to use the carrot than the Assyrians, they're when it comes time for the stick, they can get creative, we'll say, with using the stick, so to speak, I guess, in the case of impaling. Um, so, yeah, so they're concerned that this could cause problems for them. A couple reasons for this. One is because of the unrest in the region that's going to cause with Judea's neighbors, right, Jerusalem's neighbors. Unrest in the region is not something that looks good back at home in Persia when your whole job is to make sure that this area stays stable. This is also a time of revolts. Darius did not have a smooth rise to power. There was a lot of debate about who Darius's parents were and if he was a legitimate king, and just if he was the one supposed to be in power, as there was during a lot of power shifts. But it was not a smooth transition over to Darius. Some provinces revolted. Babylon would actually eventually revolt under Darius, and he killed a lot of people in Babylon after Babylon revolts, just to make sure that everybody got the idea. Hey, don't revolt. That won't end well for you. In the first couple years of Darius's reign, Egypt revolts. And we talked about how Egypt is a very rich key area. And oh yeah, remember how Judea links Egypt to the rest of the empire? So we're having problems in Egypt. The Babylonian governors know that there's probably going to be an army. Are going to be armies going through the regions on their way to Egypt. And the Babylonian governor is looking to go, wait a minute, why are those people building a temple and walls? So we look at this, and a lot of times in church, at least, these guys were kind of portrayed as bad guys. They're not really. They're just guys doing their job. They're actually doing their due diligence here. They look at this and they're like, hey, what are you guys doing? So they ask the question, who gave you the orders to build this house and finish this structure and do these walls, guys? Just like curiosity, who gave you the orders? It says in verse 5, but the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop until until the report should reach Darius. Then an answer should be returned by Lara concerning it. So, um, so in verse 4, they ask who the names of the guys building the building are too. So they come in, they ask a bunch of questions, and the Jews tell them, "Nope, this is good. We got decrees. It's all legal." So they go, "Okay, that's cool, but we're gonna go check it out." So the kind of understanding is they continue to build the temple and work on this, but they're going to go check this out. Okay, so let's look into it. Verses um, 6 through 17. I wanted to read those, then we'll put it in the chat. I can type. The passage is too long. Boo, fish sticks. Old-fashioned way. Can I have a volunteer to read verses 6 through 17? It's a chunk of text, but it's not too scary. Go for it, Slip.
One moment here. Let me pull it up. Okay, 6 through 16 or 17, did you say?
6 through 17, so just the rest of the chapter
6
from
through
verse 6.
17.
Yep.
This is the copy of a letter which Tatinaya, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shethar Bizonai, and his colleagues of the officials, who were beyond the river, sent to Darius to the king. They sent a report to him in which it was written thus: To Darius the king, all peace. Let it be known to the king that we have gone to the province of Judah, to a house of the great God, which is being built with huge stones, and beams are being laid in the walls. This work is going on with great care, and is succeeding in their hands. Then we asked those elders, and said to them thus: Who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish the structure? We also asked them in their names, so as to inform you, that we might write down the names of the men who are at their head. Thus they answered us, saying, We are the servants of God of heaven and of earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our fathers had provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild this house of God. Also, the gold and silver utensils of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple of Jerusalem and brought them to the temple of Babylon. These King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had appointed governor. He said to him, Take these utensils, go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt in its place. Then said Sheshbazzar, Then that Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem, and from then until now it has been under construction, and it is not yet completed. Now if it pleases the king, let a search be conducted in the king's treasure house, and which is there in Babylon, if it be that a decree was issued by King of Cyrus to rebuild this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send us this decision concerning this matter.
Thank you. Okay, so we get a copy of a letter here, which is kind of fascinating, right? Like getting to read an email from the ancient world. This is not in Hebrew, by the way. This is in Aramaic. So those names that Slipperin did a great job with. I could not tell you how those are pronounced because I don't speak Aramaic and never have. Yeah. So I'm no help to you there on that. Slipperin's pronunciation sounds good to me. But anyway, so those guys, the suzerain is, and most likely his secretary or his assistant, send out this letter to Darius. And I talk about how they did their due diligence. So in verse 7, they say, "Hey, to Darius the king, all peace. We went to the province in Judah, to the house of the great God." Okay, so something I've heard in several churches. Does this mean that by them saying the house of the great God, that these guys are God-fearing Persians? Yeah, probably not. So although I don't speak Aramaic, I am told by commentaries that the text here is a bit, or the translation is a bit wonky. You can either say the house of the great God or the great house of God. Most likely they're just being respectful to the gods in their area, which the Persians were very much about. They had their own beliefs about Ahura Mazda was their god, but they were generally very respectful and tolerant of local gods, provided you didn't cause problems. As long as your god didn't cause problems, we're good with your god. That's kind of their policy. So they are just being respectful of the Jews here. So it's being built with stones. They're working on it. We asked them, who gave you the authority to do this, and who are your leaders? We get an interesting answer because above we don't get the answer from the Jewish leaders, but we do get the answer from the Jewish leaders here in this letter, which is kind of interesting, right? We get the impression that the scribe actually has the letter and is transcribing the letter here. What is the answer that the Jewish leaders give them? They give them a little bit of backstory. What kind of backstory did they give them?
The story of the exile.
Yeah. It's interesting because the question that they're asked is, on whose authority are you building this temple, right? And the simple answer is, well, Cyrus told us to do it. And they probably could have gotten away with that, but that's not what they say. They give them the story of the exile. And they say, well, we were disobedient to God. And then we're servants of God, the God of heaven and earth. We're building the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. Well, because our fathers angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed the house and carried away the people of Babylon. So it goes, however, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, Cyrus the king made a decree that this house of God be rebuilt. Okay? So, Cyrus makes this decree, and the house is then going to be rebuilt. They don't say that Cyrus told them to do it. The implication is that they're doing it on Cyrus's authority, but their real answer is that they're doing it on God's authority. That's kind of the subliminal answer. But the answer that these guys pick up on is they're doing it on Cyrus's authority, right? That's what matters to them. But we get this understanding that these Jewish leaders have actually learned a little bit from their ordeal in the exile, um, and that they understand that this ultimately comes down to God's authority, not the king's. Do you guys see that? Okay, good. They call out that the silver and gold vessels are returned, um, as part of Cyrus's decree, just in case. The Suzeraintes were looking at that, going, "Wow, I could fund a decent campaign with that gold and silver there." Just in case there's any confusion, they're like, "This was decreed by Cyrus. This be ours as well." Um, and that that this temple's be rebuilt. So, what do these guys ask then? What is the leaders here ask of the king?
Hey, could you fact check this?
Yeah. This is a CYA letter. Cover your answer. We'll say. But they are this is the most corporate, bureaucratic letter. Hey, we think this is probably good, but we don't want to be the ones to take the fall for it. So could you check on this and kind of get back to us on what to do? As Josh would say, this is I gotta speak to my manager email here. Yeah. So they're like, can you take a look at this? Okay. And they ask, this is kind of interesting. Where do they ask that that the king check for this decree?
Not in Susa.
Why do you call out that it's not in Susa? Why would we Why would that be notable?
That's where the king hangs out.
Yeah. Yeah. The Bible really fixates on Babylon a lot, both in the Old and New Testament. That's because that's where Judah originally got sacked from, and it's kind of the center of the power for the region that oversees Judah. But that's so it's easy for us to skip by this and go, yeah, we've heard about Babylon a lot, so it makes sense they're looking at Babylon. But it doesn't actually make sense that they're looking at Babylon because that's not where the king decrees from. The Persian king, lives in Susa, farther into the Persian Empire. Babylon was a big city in the area, and that's when Cyrus became the de facto rule of the empire. Is when he sacked Babylon and took it. But Cyrus is such a boss that he isn't even there for the sacking of Babylon. He actually sends one of his generals. He's like, I'm going to take Asia, or Asia Minor, what we'd call it. Has one of his generals take Babylon. But anyway, they check Babylon to see this because most likely there'd be a copy of this, a receipt of this email, if you will, in Babylon. Okay, so in the ESV it says Royal Archives. Slipperin had something else in his reading. What did Slipperin read for us in his translation?
I don't remember. Was it Vault? Or what? No,
Close.
it was in the. Sorry, go ahead.
So go ahead.
No. Was it in the temple in Babylon? I don't actually remember. I just got my hands out of the sink.
Treasury.
Treasury. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, it's the only thing more holy than the temple. Funny. Yeah. Sorry. Bad.
That would have done it. Well done.
Joke there. Okay. Yeah, the treasury. Okay. We look at this and we go, that's strange. Why would this be in the treasury? Why wouldn't it be in somewhere else? Why the treasury would be looking for this? In fact, and so that we don't have this question, the translators for the ESV clarify, they're like the archives. Okay, that's not what the original Aramaic says, though. The original Aramaic says treasury. They changed it to archives, so we don't have to ask this question. So why would it be in the in the treasury?
That was where the deposit of goods was originally made.
Yep. It's also where you would keep the really, really important government documents. Okay. So Persia they're not nearly as backwards as we would think. They are a bureaucracy, very much like a modern government is in a lot of ways. And they keep tax records, they keep census data, they keep orders and decrees and people movements. All those records of that are critical for the running of the empire. The Persians were very into law and order. That's why there was so much tension around Darius's rise to power, is because he didn't come to power in the most lawful way, one could argue. And for our people, that is very much about law and order and making sure everything is done right. It was a problem for them. But for their style of government, where they're very much about treating people fairly and using the carrot, and if you screwed up, dropping the hammer on you because you broke the law and violated these agreements, keeping copies of the agreements and their versions of executive orders, which is what this royal decree would be, was very important because they didn't want people to have to rise up and riot because they felt like they were getting treated unfairly. Because that's what people do when they feel like they're getting treated unfairly. So, to prevent that, they kept very thorough records. They treated these records as if they were money, and they kept them locked in the treasury to keep them safe because they didn't want people messing with these records. Okay, so any questions on this or anything that else you guys see that you want to talk about before we move on to the next section?
So, the fact that the records were in Babylon and not in Susa, is that simply to do with the geography of what happened?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it calls into debate some of the some of the timeline here, because the fact that they think it's in Babylon most likely comes from the Jewish leaders thinking that this decree came from Babylon. Because again, they're thinking Babylon is kind of the center of power. Cyrus is the king of Babylon, the king of Persia, but also running Babylon. So these things must be in Babylon. And these guys are thinking, hey, this is probably something to do with Babylon as well. It's because that's kind of the city that runs this area as part of this empire. It's kind of the regional capital, the state capital, if you will. This is most likely going to be there. Yeah. So it has to do with power structures and timelines. Did Cyrus give this decree while he was in Babylon, or would he? If he didn't, even if he didn't, he probably would have sent a copy of this to Babylon so that the governors know about it. Yeah, nearest courthouse sort of thing. Exactly. Yep. Because even if Cyrus gave his decree from Susa, he's going to send a copy of this to Babylon, a copy of it with the people of Judah as well. So, people of Judah, if they had a copy left, which they may not, but if they did, they would have shown it to these guys, and the guys would have gone, "Oh, that's cool. I'm gonna check out and make sure that we have the carbon copy version of that as well, just in case you guys are trying to forge it. And if you are, we're gonna come back with some problems. But if not, we're cool." So that's probably what's going on with this here. Good question. Okay. All right. Any other questions or anything before we move on to the next section? Try again, Angarth. Come on, fish sticks.
Just break it up into 2 smaller parts. Go 1 through 6 and then 7 through 12.
I want to do that.
He's had
Just
a rough
kidding.
day.
Just kidding. I'm doing it.
I'm just waiting for Fish to say the passage is too long.
Okay, can I have a volunteer to read the next section of verses? And this is the final section tonight. Verses 1 through 12 of Ezra 6.
I'll take it.
Go for it.
All right. Apologize if there are noises in the background. I'm brewing tea. Then Darius the king made a decree, and a search was made in Babylonia, in the house of the archives where the documents were stored, and in Ecbatana, the citadel that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found on which this was written, a record. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its breadth 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. And also let the gold and silver vessels in the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that is in Jerusalem, each to its place. You shall put them in the house of God. Now, therefore, Tatnai, governor of the province beyond the river, wow, that's a fun one, Shethar-Bozenai, and your associates, the governors who are in the province beyond the river, keep away. Let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of this house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river. Gracious. And whatever is needed, bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests at Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Also, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. May the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put a hand put out a hand to alter this, or to destroy this house of God that is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make this a decree. Let it be done with all diligence.
Thank you.
Yup.
Gotta love Persians. Okay. So, this is one of those things that seems kind of dry until we start digging into some of the details. So, where is the decree found? Because they find the decree, right? We just read that from Cyrus. They find the carbon copy, the record of the email, if you will. Where do they find this this email, this carbon copy? Yeah, fun name place, Ecbatana.
Ecbatana. It's a great name.
Yep, we know where this place is. Actually, it's in Iran.
Mhm.
Yeah, you can visit if you want.
Well,
you know,
it's in Iran, but
it's not quite that easy, but you know, in a perfect world, you can visit it. Yeah. Okay. Is that near Babylon? My first question was going to be, is that Babylon? But I give you guys more credit. Obviously, you know that's not Babylon. Is that near Babylon?
I have no idea. It says it's in Media.
which would be modern day Iran.
Yeah, it's not super close. So it's in northern Iran. Babylon is kind of in southwestern Iraq. So or more central Iraq, I guess. But yeah, so it's a long decent ways away. Okay. The heads of the Babylonian province said they were going to look in Babylon, right? That's where they got authorization to look. How do we have somebody finding this in Ecbatana? The reason why it's in Ecbatana, by the way, is Ecbatana is the summer palace for Persian kings. It's a little bit cooler up there than it is in Susa, so you spend some of your years. Very common for great kings to have summer palaces to get out of the heat and to stay in a nice climate. So the idea is that Cyrus is up there when he makes this decree. Thorough librarians, yeah. So it's we don't. This is implied. This is not stated. But it's interesting. There's almost like there's somebody involved in this process who has a personal interest in finding this, right? Because it is not a simple thing. It's not so much like just clicking through emails to find this stuff, and that is a long, treacherous journey to go up to Ecbatana to find this. When honestly, it's the easiest thing is just to be like, nope, shut it down for the building of the temple.
Exactly.
So somebody is very, very thorough. Okay. Maybe it could be a Jewish librarian. Let's hold that thought in the back of our mind as we keep going through this. Okay. So they find the decree, and there's some details in the decree that the Jews didn't mention to these guys. So, what is anything significant about the dimensions, the little blueprint rather we get here in this decree?
I wonder if we're going to go back in history to a decree when somebody else built another temple and see if it matches up.
Yeah, because we definitely haven't hyperlinked back to Solomon at all in this book, right? No, that's exactly it. You guys see it. This is the same size as Solomon's Great Temple. Yeah. So they're supposed to rebuild the spec. Um, which is interesting because the people were kind of sad about the rebuilding, thinking it wasn't going to be as good. Okay, but at least here they say, hey, same dimensions. Okay. Um, let there be 3 great layers of stones and 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Hmm. um, and then also let the gold and silver vessels of God be there, just in case anybody was buying those vessels with the intent of moving them into the war effort that's going on. Nope, those are supposed to be there. That's part of the order. Okay, so that's the record that they find. Well, that's certainly good. That bodes well. It's even more than the Jewish people were telling the governor that they had authorization for. So Darius goes and gives his ruling. He says, "Okay, you guys," and he gives their names, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. Let the work on this house. He goes, "Keep away." That's a little harsh and brusque. Why does he say "keep away"?
Bugger off.
He do you guys have any ideas as to why he might be being that harsh?
He actually does kind of mention that, so that makes sense. Also, if I'm remembering, isn't the name of the governor here, Tatnai, the same guy that was mentioned back in chapter 4 when they wrote the letter to in reference to the Jews to try and get the building of the temple shut down? Because if that guy, Tatnai, is the same guy, then it would make sense that he's like, well, hang on, we already dealt with this. Why should I do this? Now he's like, well, now we're having a reversal of.
I'm looking back and I'm not seeing it in chapter
Okay,
4.
I could be wrong. These names are, it's not like Mike and Joe. It's things that have 18 letters and only 2 vowels.
Because they get shut down in the time of Cyrus, so it may or may not be the same guy. Yeah. Yeah. So I've always wondered this too. Like, wow, it seems a little harsh. It's a legal phrase. It basically means that they're cleared of all accusations. So it's specifically phrased in Aramaic to be a legal declaration of innocent here. So that's why he's saying it is specifically that way, which is kind of interesting. There's just some interesting little Persian customs going on here. Then like Kessa said, they get a stimulus check, right? Like the original order said, hey, like we need to be funding this. So he goes and writes them a stimulus check. Okay. So they're gonna get all of this aid. This work is gonna be funded by the Persian government. Interestingly, how is the Persian government gonna get these funds? By the way, they don't have the kind of economy where they can just print money back then. They did not have that luxury. This is not a fiat currency.
Is it not coming out of the tax revenue?
It is coming out of the tax revenue. Okay. So, I mentioned how Persia is organized by province. So it's not coming from Susa, this money. It's going to be the local governor's responsibility to, or the local suzerainte's responsibility to raise these funds. So who's he going to tax to send the money to the temple building project?
Oh, how the fates have turned.
Yeah. Fortune spins like a wheel, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, he's going to be taxing the Samaritans and the people who tried to get this thing shut down. So that's what you get for narking out the Jews to the local suzerainte, right? Is oh, by the way, good thing. Hey, thanks for having us check on that. We actually were supposed to be funding that, so if you could fork over, some of your gold, so we could go take it up to rebuild the temple, that'd be awesome, guys. I'm sure that's going to go over really well back home on the home front. And then, but not only that, we get some specific items listed here. What are some of the specific things that Darius tells them to make sure that they're willing to provide?
Animals for the sacrifices. Sheep, rams, cattle, stuff like that.
Yeah, and any pigs in there?
I don't see no pigs.
No pigs, huh? Weird. Okay. Huh. Everything's pretty kosher with that. That's odd. Do you think that the king himself is like a Jewish custom expert or anything?
It feels like something that I was told to put in the back of my head is tingling.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? This is there's definitely some we talked about fingerprints before. There's definitely some Jewish fingerprints on this order, isn't there? Because not only is this decree found in a kind of a place where we were not supposed to be looking necessarily, but we've kind of miraculously, as my charismatic friends would say, found the decree over there. And then miraculously, we get some animals, but not just any animals. Animals that are specifically designated for temple sacrifice, and then materials that are specifically designated for temple sacrifice, decreed to be given to the temple project. In addition to just the vindictive smugness that I get from the people who are paying for this, and the people who tried to shut it down. Uh, the uh, the person who's interested in politics and history, that part of me really likes that little point there. But yeah, so we definitely get some fingerprints here that there might be somebody working in the background. Okay. So there's a couple ways to look at this. A simple way is to say God did this. Of course, God is ultimately responsible for doing this. But could perhaps God be using Jewish assistants or Jewish officials who did not return to Judea, who stayed in Susa and stayed as part of the government as advisors, to be bringing about some of these changes? I think that the evidence here is pretty clear for that. Okay. Um, so just be thinking about that when we're talking about takeaways here.
For what it's worth, Farmer Gal asked a pretty good question. Where does this happen in line with guys like Daniel? The latest stuff that Daniel wrote, as far as I know, was written in the first year of Darius. And this is happening, as Unger said, around the third year. So it's not unlikely that Daniel would have been at least alive. He would have been an old dude.
So,
but even in that, there's evidence of high-ranking Jewish people within the Persian Empire. So that only leads a little more credence to the possibility. Of what Ongert was saying about the Jewish influence.
So the timeline on Daniel is a little bit different. Daniel is actually alive during Cyrus's reign. So Cyrus takes over Babylon, and Daniel is there for the transition from the Babylonians to Persian rule.
That just makes things even more confusing.
So this is definitely after Daniel, but Daniel was a Persian official, right? So there is definitely Daniel connections in that Daniel was a high-ranking member of the Persian government. So there's no reason why there can't be other Jewish officials out there as well.
Thanks for the correction on that. Gosh, why does the Persians have to be so difficult?
Yeah, and like I kind of get the impression that like the Jewish scribes don't always understand how the Persian government works. So we get like some weird confusing terminology used for the Persians as well. Now granted, a lot of the sources we have talk about the Persians are Greek, who also don't totally understand how the Persian government works.
Oh yeah, and they were big fans.
Yeah, huge fans. Love the Persians. Big fans. But at least with Darius, though, we do have some Persian records.
Yes.
About that. Darius was always kind of insecure about his reign, so much so that he actually carved up a mountain to explain how legitimate his reign was. So we do have Darius' side of the story for a lot of Darius' reign too. But that's neither here nor there. On that note of carving up the mountain, we get this little thing here, and yes, the ESV translates it impalement, which is interesting because then they go back and they translate Esther as hanging, if I remember
Hanging.
correctly. Yeah,
Mhm.
same terminology used in Aramaic. um, uh, it's kind of a this is a very Persian punishment. The punishment of pulling a board out of your house, so you have to watch your house collapse. And oh, by the way, we're going to impale you on that board. Impalement, by the way, is a pretty horrible way to die. Ancient records tend to indicate that it usually took about 30 to 40 plus hours to die in impalement. If you got a really good impaler, he would make sure that he missed all the vital organs. So you just sat there and kind of squirmed around for a while and was really uncomfortable. We do actually have the on the records that Darius left. We find that he impaled a sorry guys. I'll get less graphic eventually. On the records that Darius left us on the side of the mountain, he made sure to notify us that when Babylon later revolted in his reign, he made sure to impale several people in Babylon to send a message as to who was really king. In fact, the guy who set himself up as king in Babylon, when he impaled him, he wrote on the spike, this guy is a liar because he said, I'm the king of Babylon. The Persians knew how to smack talk their enemies.
Yeah,
and to send a message. So
yeah. When we said that the Persians knew how to use the stick, it was a big stick.
Yeah.
And usually it was in you.
Yeah. So this is a very Persian punishment here. And it definitely be scared for the people around them. This is the sort of thing that's usually reserved for like traitors. So it's interesting that the king is saying if you oppose the building of the temple, you are a traitor to the Persian Empire, and you will be treated as such. Okay. Yeah. So this is his kind of favorite punishment for traitors, Darius, as he did to several thousand people in Babylon. Happy thoughts. But so not exactly happy thoughts for the people around them, but maybe a little bit relieving for the people of Jerusalem to get, because this is the fate that would have awaited them if this had broken a little bit differently. But now, the fate that their enemies are supposed to bring about on them is actually projected for their enemies. That certainly doesn't have any parallels to the Book of Esther at all. I'm sure. so yeah. But yeah, you can see some of the parallels in other books, obviously. It is interesting as well that the king's condition is that the people who rebuild the temple remember him in their prayers to their God, right? Make sure that your God prays for me, right? Yeah, there is, Kess. There is, and that's why it was such a big a deal to find this record, is because there are everybody always says you can't break the laws of the Medes and the Persians. If you're creative enough, you can find ways, and the Persian kings do later on in their reigns. But yeah, you're not supposed to. So it is a big deal. It's a big part of the appeal of the Persian Empire. Is this supposed to be a system of laws? So yeah, there is definitely a shout out to that as well. Yeah, and then again, the whole remembering your prayers. That's partially to keep the people loyal, partially hedging his bets, because with the Persians, we're dealing with a lot of different gods. Always a good idea to keep them all happy with us, and also partially a sign of respect. The Persians don't. When the Persians go to war with Greece, and they go to war hard with the Greeks, they do not ask the Greeks to pray to their gods for them. In fact, they defile Greek temples. So this does show, to an extent, some level of respect for the god of Judea. Again, that's partially a self-serving respect, but it's something that the people in Jerusalem would have thought, that's kind of unusual for this time period. Which it wasn't that unusual for the Persians, but the Persians were certainly an exception to the rule of the area in this. Okay, So, in a classic Ungrowth Bible study, we have gone down lots of historical bunny trails tonight, and you've learned lots of very useless knowledge about Persian customs and the historical context surrounding this passage. Apart from that, it's a fairly straightforward passage. Not a lot of confusion here. Not a lot of confusion here as to what's happening. My question is this, though: what do we take away from this week? This is a fun story, and it's a cool story. But how do we take encouragement from this week as we face the struggles that we may face in our communities?
At least we're not getting impaled on sticks.
Well, that's a great takeaway, Bandit. It's true.
Well, for those that aren't, okay. Whew.
That was a close one. That was a close one.
That was close. That was close.
Give a nod of recognition to that. But before we go off into after hours, sort of
Sorry.
levels of content, I do think there are some good takeaways for us. One is Kessa's that should put down on the channel. God reversing the reversal with interest, right? I don't know about you guys, but if I'm finally starting to make progress after a long period of struggle, and I encounter a difficulty or reversal, I tend to not handle it very well. So that could just be a me thing, but that's something I've noticed about myself. So it's possible, and I think very probable, that the Israelites were facing a very similar thing, right? They have, depending upon the timeline, 70 to 50 years of exile here. They finally it breaks their way, right? They get a reversal, a decree from the king to go back and rebuild their temple. But then they encounter all these problems from these traders, if you will, these Samaritans, and the surrounding people that resist them and shut this project down. Okay. Then they get a word from God, and God goes, why are we having this conversation, basically? I told you guys to rebuild this stuff. Rebuild it. They start rebuilding it, and the Persian officials, who are just doing their job, honestly, come down, they're like, hey, do you guys have authorization for this? And now they're waiting on pins and needles, because if nobody back in Susa can find the records, they're going to wind up they could be in a sticky situation, one could say, over this, right? But it's totally in God's control. Much like the book of Esther, we don't, in this particular this set of passages, we don't get God did this, right? But it's certainly implied. We see the fingerprints of God putting the right people in the right spots to bring about the right outcome here. And not just an outcome that is allows them to keep rebuilding the temple, but an outcome that funds it at the expense of their enemies who are trying to shut it down. A little bit of a perhaps a little Genesis reference there. What man meant for bad, God is used for good. A little Egyptian exile, perhaps, reference there. But we certainly see that happening here, right? So perhaps we can take some encouragement, or at least I can this week, that when we encounter difficulties and setbacks, God is in control of those setbacks and is fully capable of using those setbacks for good. Because we see that here, right? Okay, that's one takeaway. Any other takeaways from this that we could apply this week?
I'm genuinely impressed by the humility shown by the Jewish leaders in their answer to the governors.
Yeah.
That's something that throughout the Jewish history up to this point is just so rare. And the way in which, it's like, who gave you authority? They had the potential to give the answer like, oh, Cyrus told us to do this. That would have been so easy. But to recognize that, their own rebellion, and to say, God did this, and then that same breath to recognize that it's God that's led them back here in spite of their own failures and sins of the past is just remarkable. really
it's-
shows tremendous growth for the Jewish people in their understanding and willingness to accept that they goofed, but are willing to come back to God and believing that He would redeem them. Outstanding stuff.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point. It shows that the exile wasn't wasted, right? When my brother and I were talking about this, Ezra and some of the lessons for returning today, that was one of the things he pulled out was it shows that part of a good return is a return in humility, a return understanding that we're not returning on our own power, but through God's grace, right? And these guys have a healthy perspective on that, which is good. That's certainly progress. Good. Good point, Lincoln. Anything else?
Can't get over the part where the enemies now have to foot the bill. The irony of that is so powerful.
Yeah, that's something that's kind of glossed over sometimes when we cover this in churches. But yeah, this is not just a return to rebuilding. This is a rebuilding that is enemy funded, right? So these guys brought on by making the leaders go back and double check everything. They brought on them having to now pay for this temple. Yeah, and on a practical level, because Judah is of course strapped for cash. She's a shadow of her from herself. She doesn't have the resources to undertake this sort of project very easily, which is why it's taking so long. On a practical level, like you said, it's God providing financial resources, right? It's not like God is too spiritual to provide money. Like it's within His power. He can do it, and He will do it. Yeah, very good point, Farmer Gal. Very good point. Shows that God's working behind the scenes. It's got kind of an Esther vibe in that sense. Yeah, Esther happens after this, but yeah, it's certainly the same sort of thing. I have one more takeaway for us, and that's this. I truly think that God used one or several Jewish officials in Persian government to bring about this outcome. That's how we find um, most likely how we find the decree in the Summer Palace. Most likely how we get the list of kosher um, kosher temple products, if you will, to be sent over as well. There's Jewish fingerprints all over this. Um, even in the severity of the punishment being dealt out, I kind of wonder if a Jewish advisor said to the king, by opposing Cyrus's decree, it's almost like these guys are committing treason, right? The king's like, yeah, I hate treason. I impale it. Put that in there. So, so I kind of get the idea there's some sort of like Daniel figure in the background with this. Okay. Yeah. Um, and that does not take away from God's glory in this. Obviously, that means that God put that person there. Okay. So God, through His power, put someone there. If I'm right about that, and some of the commentators are as well. The commentators are pretty unanimous that that's what's happening here as well. But if we're right about that, that means that God put someone there. Okay. That person probably doesn't have the most exciting job. Okay. Well, everybody else got to go back and rebuild the temple at Jerusalem and be, super spiritual about, offering sacrifice at the temple and stuff. They stayed in the pagan court at Susa and served the pagan king. They were probably looked down upon a little bit by their countrymen. And they kind of thought to themselves, it's a bummer that I was, I kind of wonder if I should have gone back. That's a bummer that I wasn't called back to the temple, if you will. But God uses their position to, without giving their name, right? Because we don't get those people's name. They're not like an Ezra or Nehemiah. But without using their name, without giving them the glory, God uses their position to further the temple project, right? They are absolutely critical to this story. Absolutely critical. So it's possible, as you go back to work or school or family this week, whatever it may be, that you have a position that God's put you in that you see no value in. Yeah, laundry you see as kind of mundane, right? It's not, man. I'm not, in the frickin' Middle East, you know, delivering the good news, you know, under threat of ISIS attack or what have you, like some missionaries are. And I'm not talking down about missionaries; they have a critical part of the mission, right? Obviously, but we oftentimes think of ourselves, you know, I just have a job where I, you know, punch the clock at a grocery store or what have you. Well, I think we're finding out that some of those jobs are more important than we thought. But nonetheless, that that job, what you're doing, what you've been called to, is not unimportant to God. And perhaps God has you in that job or that role or that responsibility, whether that be at school. When I say job, I don't mean like you know necessarily a 9 to 5 job. I mean whatever He has you doing this week, whatever He's called you to, whether that be for family or for school or what have you, or an actual job. Whatever He has for you this week, maybe He has you there for a reason. Um, to serve a greater goal this week. Okay. And by just being faithful at your job, by doing the due diligence on looking for a receipt, if you will, by doing that, He is going to use you to bless people who you will never meet and never see. Just something to think about. Something to encourage us to go back to our mundane, in quotes, calling this week that may or may not be so mundane. Because for this